On July 28, 1945, at 9:40 in the morning, a United States Army bomber slammed into the 79th floor of the Empire State Building at over 200 miles per hour. 14 people died instantly. A fireball erupted through 3 floors of America's tallest building. An elevator operator plummeted 75 stories in a free-falling metal cage and somehow lived to tell about it. And here's the thing that will blow your mind. Most Americans have never heard this story. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering the untold stories of World War II. 56 years before the September 11th attacks, before anyone imagined a plane could become a weapon, a B-25 Mitchell bomber punched a hole in the very symbol of American ambition. The impact shook Midtown Manhattan. People thought the war had come home. They thought the Germans or Japanese had somehow launched one final, desperate strike against the heart of New York City. But here's what they didn't tell you. The plane wasn't carrying enemies. It was carrying Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith, Jr., a decorated American war hero, just trying to get home. This is the story of how one foggy morning turned into one of the most dramatic rescues in New York Fire Department history. This is about how a woman survived what should have been mathematically impossible. This is about a disaster that was buried by wartime censorship, overshadowed by victory celebrations, and nearly erased from collective memory. And this is about the lessons we failed to learn because we were too eager to forget. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day. And I promise you by the end of this, you're going to wonder why this isn't taught in every history class in America. Picture this. It's late July 1945. World War II in Europe has been over for less than 3 months. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The celebration in Times Square was the biggest party New York had ever seen. American flags still hang from every window. Victory gardens still bloom in Central Park. The war against Japan continues in the Pacific, but for the first time in 4 years, Americans can breathe without wondering if their sons will come home. New York is at the absolute peak of its confidence. The Empire State Building, completed just 14 years earlier in 1931, stands as a 102-story monument to American engineering and ambition. At 1,454 feet tall, it's the tallest building in the world. Nothing even comes close. It dominates the skyline like an Art Deco cathedral piercing the clouds. On clear days, you can see it from 50 miles away. The building represents everything America wants to believe about itself in 1945. We built the tallest structure on Earth during the Great Depression. We helped win the most devastating war in human history. We're invincible. Nothing can touch us here. But here's what nobody understood yet. That confidence was about to be tested in the most horrifying way imaginable. Lieutenant Colonel William F. Smith, Jr. was 31 years old, West Point graduate, veteran bomber pilot with hundreds of combat missions under his belt. He'd flown B-17s over Europe, navigating through flak and fighter attacks, bringing his crew alive mission after mission. The man knew how to fly. He had over 2,000 hours of flight time. He'd seen combat. He'd made life-or-death decisions in the sky while people were actively trying to kill him. On July 28th, Smith wasn't flying a combat mission. He was doing something pilots called a milk run, a simple domestic transport flight. He was ferrying a B-25 Mitchell bomber from Bedford Airfield in Massachusetts to Newark Airport in New Jersey. The B-25 was a twin-engine medium bomber, the same type that Jimmy Doolittle used to raid Tokyo 2 years earlier. It was a reliable workhorse, not some experimental death trap. Smith had 2 other people with him, Staff Sergeant Christopher Domitrovich, his navigator, and Albert Perna, a Navy machinist getting a lift. 3 men on a routine flight that should have taken about an hour. They took off from Bedford at 8:59 in the morning. The weather report showed potential fog over New York, but nothing that would ground an experienced pilot. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. Fly south, land at Newark, file some paperwork, go home. Smith had probably made similar flights dozens of times. But here's the thing about fog in New York City. It doesn't behave like fog anywhere else. The city sits at the convergence of the Hudson River, the Easter River, and the Atlantic Ocean. When weather systems move through, the moisture gets trapped between the water and the heat radiating from millions of square feet of concrete and steel. The fog doesn't roll in gradually like it does in the countryside. It appears suddenly, thick as cotton, cutting visibility to 0 in minutes. And in 1945, air traffic control wasn't what you're imagining. There was no radar, no sophisticated tracking systems, no computer screens showing every aircraft in the sky. Controllers relied on visual contact and radio reports from pilots. If you couldn't see the plane and the pilot couldn't see the ground, you were basically flying blind. At 9:30 a.m., Smith radioed LaGuardia Airport to request permission to land. LaGuardia controllers looked at the weather and said no. Visibility was less than 3 miles. The ceiling, that's the height of the lowest clouds, was only about 1,000 feet. For context, that's dangerous. You need to see where you're going when you're flying a 20-ton metal tube through the sky. The controllers told Smith to proceed to Newark as planned. Newark supposedly had better visibility. But here's where the story starts to go sideways. Newark's weather actually wasn't better. The same fog bank was covering northern New Jersey. But Smith either didn't know that or decided to press on anyway. At 9:35 a.m., Smith contacted the control tower at Newark Airport. He reported his position and requested landing instructions. The tower asked him to stand by. They were checking the weather conditions, standard procedure. But Smith didn't wait. Maybe he was confident. Maybe he was eager to get home. Maybe he thought his combat experience meant he could handle anything. Whatever the reason, he began his descent toward Manhattan, dropping altitude to find visual references on the ground. This is where experienced pilots make a critical error. When you can't see in fog, your instinct is to go lower, to get under the cloud layer and see the ground. But in a city filled with skyscrapers, going lower can be a death sentence, and Smith was descending fast. At 9:40 a.m., Smith was flying at approximately 400 feet above sea level. Let me put that in perspective. The Empire State Building's roof is 1,250 feet above sea level. Smith was flying 850 feet below the 79th floor. He was level with the 79th floor, and he couldn't see it coming. Imagine being in that cockpit. You're a decorated war veteran. You've flown through hell. You've navigated through storms and enemy fire. You know your instruments. You trust your skills. The fog is thick, but you've handled worse. You're descending carefully, watching for buildings, confident you'll break through the clouds any second and see the familiar landmarks of Manhattan spread out below you. And then, in less time than it takes to blink, gray fog becomes gray concrete. Steel beams and windows materialize directly in front of your windscreen. You have maybe 1 second to realize what's happening. Not enough time to pull up, not enough time to turn, not enough time to do anything except understand that you've made a fatal mistake. At 9:49 a.m., the B-25 Mitchell bomber, traveling at approximately 250 miles per hour, crashed directly into the north side of the Empire State Building between the 79th and 80th floors. The sound was apocalyptic. Witnesses on the street described it as an explosion that shook buildings for blocks. The planes punched through the exterior wall like it was paper. The plane's fuel tanks, carrying approximately 800 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline, exploded on impact. A massive fireball erupted through the building, shooting flames out the opposite side and up through the floors above. The force of the impact was so violent that one of the plane's engines tore completely through the building, shot out the south side, crossed an entire city block while still traveling hundreds of feet per second, crashed through the roof of a 12-story building across the street, and plummeted down through multiple floors before starting a fire that would burn for hours. The second engine and part of the landing gear fell down an elevator shaft, severing the cables and sending 2 elevator cars into free fall. 14 people died in the first 10 seconds. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, Staff Sergeant Domitrovich, and Albert Perna were killed instantly in the cockpit. 11 people working in the offices of the War Relief Services and the National Catholic Welfare Conference were incinerated by the fireball or crushed by debris. The 79th floor became hell on Earth. The aviation fuel created temperatures over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Office furniture ignited immediately. Papers turned to ash. The walls themselves began to burn. People on the floors above and below felt the entire building shake and thought for a terrifying moment that the whole structure was coming down.
And here's what makes this even more horrifying. Most people in Manhattan didn't know what had happened. They just heard an enormous explosion from the direction of the Empire State Building. They saw smoke pouring from the upper floors. And their first thought wasn't accident. Their first thought was attack. Remember, this is July 1945. The war with Japan is still raging. Nobody trusts that peace is permanent. Everyone knows that New York is a prime target. The paranoia from Pearl Harbor never fully went away. So when people heard that explosion and saw smoke pouring from the Empire State Building, panic spread through the city like wildfire. Was it a bomb? Did a Japanese plane somehow cross the Pacific? Were the Germans launching one final suicide mission? For those first few minutes, before information could spread, thousands of people thought the war had come home. The shockwave of the impact was felt for miles. Windows shattered in nearby buildings. People inside the Empire State Building on lower floors felt the structure sway and heard a sound like thunder rolling through the steel skeleton. Alarms began blaring, people started screaming, and in the chaos and confusion, nobody knew if they should run up or run down or just stay where they were. On the 79th floor, the survivors who weren't killed instantly faced an impossible situation. The main stairwells were blocked by fire. The elevators were clearly not an option. Nobody knew which ones were still functioning and which cables had been severed. Smoke was filling the corridors, making it hard to breathe, hard to see, hard to think. And here's where the heroes emerged. The New York Fire Department received the first call at 9:50 a.m., 1 minute after impact. The report was confusing, borderline incoherent. Plane crash, Empire State Building, fire on the upper floors, possible collapse. The dispatcher wasn't sure if this was real or some kind of hysteria-induced false alarm. But Fire Battalion Chief Joseph Connery didn't hesitate. He ordered every available unit in Midtown to respond immediately. Within 6 minutes, 14 fire companies were racing toward the Empire State Building. Ladder companies, engine companies, rescue squads, everyone who could help. When Connery arrived and saw smoke pouring from the 79th floor, he understood immediately that this was going to be one of the most dangerous fire operations in the department's history. Fighting a fire on the 79th floor meant carrying equipment up 79 flights of stairs. Every piece of hose, every tool, every bit of gear had to be hauled up manually. The elevators were unsafe. The stairs were narrow. The smoke was rising through the stairwells like a chimney. And they had no idea if the structure was stable. But here's what separated these men from ordinary people. They didn't stop to debate the risks. They didn't form committees to assess the danger. They grabbed their equipment and started climbing. 79 floors, with full gear, in smoke and heat, not knowing if the structure above them was about to collapse and crush them under thousands of tons of steel and concrete. The climb took over 20 minutes. By the time the first firefighters reached the 79th floor, they were exhausted, breathing hard, muscles screaming, and they hadn't even started fighting the fire yet. What they found was worse than they'd imagined. The entire north side of the floor was gone. Just a massive hole punched through the exterior wall, 20 feet wide and 18 feet tall. Twisted metal and shattered concrete everywhere. Fires burning in multiple rooms, fed by aviation fuel that had splashed across everything. Bodies, some burned beyond recognition, some crushed by debris. The smell of jet fuel and burning flesh. And somewhere in that chaos, there were survivors. People had taken refuge in interior offices, away from the impact zone. Some had made it to the stairwells on the opposite side of the floor. Others were trapped, blocked by fire, calling for help. The firefighters began a methodical search and rescue operation while simultaneously fighting the flames. But here's where the story takes a turn that defies belief. Here's where we meet Betty Lou Oliver, and here's where this disaster becomes something entirely different. Betty Lou Oliver was 20 years old. She worked as an elevator operator in the Empire State Building. If you don't know what that job entailed in 1945, let me explain. Elevators weren't automatic back then. Someone had to physically operate them, controlling the speed and stopping precisely at each floor. It required skill and attention. It was considered a respectable job for a young woman. Betty Lou was on duty on the 80th floor when the plane hit one floor below her. The explosion blew out the elevator doors. The shock wave knocked her unconscious. When she came to, she was badly burned and surrounded by fire and smoke. Other survivors helped her into a stairwell and down to the 75th floor, where a medical team had set up a temporary triage station.
The rescuers assessed her burns and decided she needed to get to a hospital immediately. The stairwells were clogged with firefighters and equipment. The fastest way down was an elevator. Now, let me be absolutely clear about how insane this decision sounds in retrospect. A plane had just crashed into the building. Elevator shafts were compromised, cables were damaged, everything was still chaotic and uncertain. But in the moment, with a critically injured woman who needed immediate medical attention, the rescuers made what seemed like the only choice. They put Betty Lou Oliver into car number 6, along with an elevator operator and an injured man, and told the operator to take them down to the ground floor. The elevator began descending. Then the cable snapped. Car number 6, with 3 people inside, went into free fall from the 75th floor. 75 stories, over 1,000 feet, straight down. Let me give you some context for what that means. When an elevator cable snaps, there's supposed to be safety mechanisms that engage. Metal brakes called governors are supposed to clamp onto the guide rails and slow the descent. But those systems depend on the guide rails being intact and properly aligned. In a building that just got hit by a bomber, with structural damage throughout the elevator shaft, those safety systems couldn't work properly. So, car number 6 fell, accelerating under gravity, picking up speed with every floor. The people inside would have felt weightlessness for just a moment before the terror set in. They would have known what was happening. They would have known there was no escape. The elevator plummeted down the shaft, bouncing off the walls, the metal screaming as it scraped against bent guide rails. It fell past the 50th floor, past the 40th, past the 30th, accelerating toward terminal velocity. And then it hit the bottom. The impact compressed the elevator car like an accordion. The roof caved in, the walls buckled, the metal floor crumpled. When rescuers finally forced open the doors in the sub-basement, they expected to find bodies. They expected carnage. Instead, they found Betty Lou Oliver, alive. Critically injured, yes, bones broken, burns worsened, but alive, conscious, able to speak. The other 2 people in the elevator died on impact. Betty Lou survived what should have been mathematically impossible, and to this day, her survival holds the Guinness World Record for the longest survived elevator fall. How did she live? The best theory is that the elevator cables, even though they snapped, fell into the shaft below the car and created a kind of cushion of tangled metal and cable at the bottom. When the car hit, instead of striking solid concrete, it hit this mess of cable that absorbed just enough impact to prevent certain death. But that's just a theory. The truth is, nobody really knows. Betty Lou herself couldn't explain it. She just knew that she fell 75 stories in a metal box and somehow woke up afterward. The firefighters who pulled her out of that wreckage said it was the most miraculous thing they'd ever seen in their careers. And these were men who'd seen people walk out of collapsed buildings, who'd seen impossible rescues, who'd witnessed every kind of luck and tragedy the city could produce. But they'd never seen anything like Betty Lou Oliver. While Betty Lou was falling through the building, the firefighters on the 79th floor were fighting a battle against physics itself. High-octane aviation fuel burns differently than regular fire. It burns hotter, it spreads faster, it creates toxic smoke that can kill you before the flames ever touch you. The fuel had splashed into multiple rooms and down the elevator shafts. Fires were burning on the 79th, 80th, and 81st floors. The heat was so intense that steel beams were beginning to soften. Not enough to collapse, not yet, but enough to make structural engineers very nervous when they arrived on scene. The firefighters established a water relay system. Men stationed every few floors, passing hoses up the stairwells, creating a human chain from the street to the fire. It was back-breaking work, medieval by modern standards, but it was all they had. By 10:30 a.m., 40 minutes after impact, they had the main fire contained. Not extinguished, just contained, keeping it from spreading to other floors. This was already being called the most difficult high-rise fire in New York history. The rescue operation continued for hours. Firefighters systematically searched every office, every closet, every bathroom. They found survivors hiding in file rooms, in break areas, anywhere they could escape the smoke and flames. Each survivor had to be helped down 79 flights of stairs. The injured had to be carried. Meanwhile, outside the building, the scene was absolute pandemonium. Tens of thousands of people crowded the streets around the Empire State Building. Police established barriers blocks away, but people kept pushing forward, desperate to see what had happened, to understand if this was an accident or an attack. Ambulances couldn't get through the crowd. Injured people were being carried blocks away to reach medical vehicles. The entire city infrastructure around Midtown Manhattan was paralyzed. And the rumors were out of control. Some people swore they'd seen a swastika on the plane. Others insisted it was Japanese. Some claimed there had been multiple impacts, that other buildings were hit. The telephone system was overloaded with people calling loved ones, calling newspapers, calling anyone who might have information. Radio stations interrupted regular programming with fragmentary reports that only added to the confusion. A plane has struck the Empire State Building, casualties unknown, fire on multiple floors, no confirmation on whether this was an attack. For the first hour, New York City existed in a state of paralyzing uncertainty. And that uncertainty revealed something profound about the American psyche in 1945. 4 years of war had fundamentally changed how people process catastrophe. Their first assumption wasn't accident. It was attack. The enemy was defeated, but not gone. The war was ending, but not over. Nowhere felt completely safe. That paranoia wasn't irrational. It was the logical result of everything the country had experienced since Pearl Harbor. When your war starts with a surprise attack that kills thousands of people, you don't easily forget that anything can happen anywhere at any time. By noon, the fire was finally extinguished. The last survivors were brought down. The body recovery began. This was the grim phase, the phase where the heroes became undertakers, carefully removing remains from the wreckage, trying to maintain dignity for people who'd been killed in the most violent way imaginable. The final death toll was 14. 11 civilian workers in the Catholic relief offices, the 3 men on the plane. It could have been so much worse. The Empire State Building employed 10,000 people at the time. On a typical weekday, there were 15,000 people in the building at any given moment. If the plane had hit 2 hours later, when offices were fully staffed, hundreds could have died. If it had hit lower, where the floors were more densely populated, the casualties would have been catastrophic. If it had struck at a different angle, if it had carried a full bomb load instead of just fuel, if the building had been less structurally sound, any of these variables could have turned this from a disaster into an apocalypse. But even with 14 deaths, this was a tragedy that should have traumatized the nation. This was a plane hitting the world's tallest building in the heart of America's largest city. This should have been front-page news for weeks. This should have sparked congressional investigations, safety reforms, national soul-searching about how such a thing could happen. Instead, the story was buried. Not deliberately covered up, just overshadowed. 3 weeks earlier, on July 16th, the United States had successfully tested the first atomic bomb in New Mexico. On August 6th, 9 days after the Empire State Building crash, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, another bomb obliterated Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The Empire State Building crash happened in the narrow window between the end of the European War and the end of the Pacific War. It occurred during a moment when the entire nation was focused on finishing the fight, bringing the boys home, celebrating victory. Nobody wanted to hear about domestic disasters. Nobody wanted to process more tragedy. Everyone was exhausted from 4 years of death and sacrifice. So the story was reported, but briefly. Most newspapers put it on page 3 or page 5. The newsreel showed it for a few days, then moved on. Within a week, it was forgotten. By the end of August, when Japan surrendered and the real celebrations began, the crash might as well have never happened.
The official investigation was conducted jointly by the U.S. Army and the Civil Aeronautics Board. They interviewed survivors, examined the wreckage, reconstructed the airflow path, analyzed weather data. The process took 3 months. The conclusion was anticlimactic. Pilot error. Lieutenant Colonel Smith descended below the safe altitude in conditions of poor visibility. He lost situational awareness in the fog. He struck the building because he didn't know where he was. No mechanical failure, no sabotage, no malicious intent, just a mistake made by an experienced pilot who thought he could handle conditions that turned out to be beyond anyone's ability to handle safely. The report used careful language to avoid directly blaming Smith, who died in the crash and couldn't defend himself. It noted the limitations of air traffic control technology. It recommended improvements to communication systems and weather reporting. But ultimately, it concluded that the crash was preventable and resulted from the pilot's decision to continue flying in unsafe conditions. The Army quietly reprimanded the controllers at Newark for allowing Smith to attempt a landing in poor visibility. New protocols were established for fog operations around New York. The Civil Aeronautics Board issued new guidelines for minimum safe altitudes over urban areas. And then everyone moved on. The report was filed away. The headlines shifted to post-war reconstruction, the occupation of Japan, the formation of the United Nations. Within a year, few people remembered that a bomber had ever hit the Empire State Building. But here's what they didn't tell you. Here's what got lost in the rush to forget. Declassified military documents from decades later revealed that Army officials were deeply concerned about public reaction to the crash. They worried that if the story received too much attention, it would undermine confidence in military aviation at a time when the nation was transitioning to a peacetime economy that would rely heavily on commercial air travel. They worried that it would spark questions about how many other near misses had occurred during the war, about how many other pilots had made similar errors and gotten lucky, about whether the rapid expansion of military aviation during the war had sacrificed safety for speed. So they didn't suppress the story, they just didn't promote it. They answered questions when asked, but volunteered nothing. They let the natural cycle of news push the story aside. And it worked. Within months, the crash was a footnote. Within years, it was trivia. Within decades, it was nearly forgotten. But here's what's important. Here's why the story matters. The Empire State Building didn't collapse. Let me say that again. A 20-ton bomber traveling at 250 miles per hour, loaded with 800 gallons of high-octane fuel, hit a skyscraper and exploded. The resulting fire burned at temperatures over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel beams were exposed to intense heat. The structure was compromised. And the building stood. Why? Because of how it was designed. The Empire State Building was built using a steel skeleton construction method. The outer walls don't support the weight of the structure. The inner steel frame does. The exterior walls are basically decorative. When the plane punched through the north wall and exited the south wall, it didn't compromise the fundamental integrity of the building. The steel beams absorbed the impact. They bent but didn't break. They heated up but didn't melt. The building swayed. People on lower floors felt it move, but it didn't collapse. The engineering tolerances built into the structure proved to be exactly what was needed. The engineers who designed the Empire State Building in the late 1920s never imagined a scenario where a plane would hit it. Commercial aviation barely existed. Military bombers weren't flying over Manhattan. The idea would have seemed absurd. But they over-engineered the structure anyway. They built in massive safety margins. They used more steel than they technically needed. They designed for worst-case scenarios that seemed impossible at the time. And 74 years later, on September 11, 2001, when 2 Boeing 767 jets struck the Trade Center towers, engineers studying the collapse would look back at the Empire State Building crash and ask what was different. The Trade Center towers were built using a different technique called tube frame construction. The outer walls were the structure. They supported the weight. When the planes compromised the exterior walls and the fires weakened the steel, the buildings couldn't maintain their integrity. They collapsed. The Empire State Building survived its plane crash because its core was separate from its skin. The Trade Center towers couldn't survive because their skin was their core. I'm not trying to make a simple one-to-one comparison. The situations were vastly different. The Empire State Building was hit by a much smaller plane at much lower speed with much less fuel. The Trade Center was subjected to sustained fires that burned much longer and much hotter. The engineering was different. The circumstances were different. But the fundamental lesson remains. How we build determines what survives. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. If the Empire State Building crash had received more attention in 1945, if it had sparked a national conversation about aviation safety and building design and disaster preparedness, would 9/11 have unfolded differently? Maybe not. Maybe the lessons wouldn't have translated. Maybe the World Trade Center towers would have fallen anyway, because the scale was too different. But maybe architects would reconsider tube frame construction. Maybe aviation security would have been tighter. Maybe the national consciousness would have been different. We'll never know, because the story was forgotten. Betty Lou Oliver lived. She spent months in the hospital recovering from her burns and broken bones. She endured dozens of surgeries. The doctors told her she'd probably never walk normally again. She proved them wrong. She lived until 1999, 54 years after the crash. She gave a few interviews over the decades, usually around anniversaries of the event. She always spoke calmly about the experience, without drama or embellishment. She said she didn't remember much about the fall itself, just darkness and noise and then waking up in pain. She said the thing that haunted her wasn't the fall. It was the moment on the 80th floor when the plane hit and she felt the building shake and thought she was going to die. The fall was just falling. The impact was terror. She never went back to the Empire State Building. Someone asked her once if she wanted to visit the observation deck, to see the city from the place where she'd almost died. She said no, she'd seen enough of that building for one lifetime. The firefighters who climbed those 79 floors, who fought that fire, who saved those lives, some of them became legends within the FDNY. Their photographs hung in firehouses across the city. When new recruits asked about the hardest fire anyone had ever fought, old-timers would tell stories about the day the bomber hit. But the general public forgot. The story became the kind of thing you'd hear as bar trivia. Did you know a plane once hit the Empire State Building? Most people would say no, they didn't know that, and then the conversation would move on. The building itself bears no obvious scars. The damaged sections were repaired within weeks, the exterior was patched and refinished, the offices were renovated. Within 2 months, you couldn't tell anything had happened. The building was designed to be resilient. It proved it. There's a small display in the Empire State Building's lobby now. A few photographs, a brief description of the crash. Most people walk past it without noticing. The tourists are too excited about going up to the observation deck. The office workers have seen it so many times it's invisible. But pieces of the bomber are still in museum collections. The engine that tore through the building and crashed into the building across the street is preserved at the New York City Fire Museum. It's a hulking piece of twisted metal, still bearing scorch marks from the fire. It sits in a glass case with a small placard explaining its history. I've seen it. I stood there looking at this chunk of a B-25, imagining it tearing through a building at hundreds of miles per hour, and trying to comprehend the physics of that moment. The violence, the noise, the terror. And I thought about how easily this story could have been completely forgotten. If one firefighter hadn't kept a journal, if one photographer hadn't been in the right place, if one survivor hadn't agreed to be interviewed decades later, this could have vanished from history entirely. So why did it happen? That's the question that matters, right? We know how it happened, pilot error and fog, but why did it happen? What was the deeper cause? You could blame the technology. Air traffic control in 1945 was primitive. No radar, no transponders, no computerized tracking. Controllers relied on visual contact and radio communication. In fog, they were essentially blind. Modern air traffic control systems would have prevented this crash before it started. The controllers would have seen Smith descending too low. They would have ordered him to climb. The warning systems would have given him enough time to react. But technology is just one factor. You could also blame the culture. Military aviation in 1945 was built on a foundation of risk-taking and confidence. Pilots were trained to be aggressive, to push limits, to trust their skills. That mindset was necessary for combat. It kept people alive in situations where hesitation meant death. But peacetime flying is different. It requires caution. It requires humility. It acknowledges that sometimes the correct decision is to turn around, to delay, to wait for better conditions. Smith had survived combat by being bold. On July 28, 1945, boldness killed him. You could blame the transition. Smith was flying a milk run after years of combat missions. His brain was calibrated for one type of flying, and he was being asked to do another. The switch isn't easy. Combat pilots returning to civilian life often struggled with adjusting to peacetime norms. They'd been heroes, making split-second decisions, taking calculated risks. Now they were expected to follow boring protocols and prioritize safety over mission completion. Smith probably didn't think he was taking a serious risk. He'd flown in worse conditions. He'd navigated through flak and fighters and storms. A little fog over Manhattan? He'd handled worse. Except this time, the risk wasn't theoretical. The skyscrapers were real. The margin for error was zero. Or maybe you blame the moment. July 1945 was a weird time in American history. The war was ending, but not ended. Everyone was exhausted, but also excited. The rules were changing, but nobody knew what the new rules were. People were caught between wartime discipline and peacetime freedom. Smith was caught between his identity as a warrior and his reality as a transport pilot doing routine work. The truth is probably all of these factors combined. Technology, culture, psychology, timing. Remove any one element and maybe the crash doesn't happen. But they all came together on that foggy morning and 14 people died. Let me tell you what bothers me most about this story. It's not that the crash happened. Accidents happen. Mistakes happen. That's part of being human. What bothers me is that we learned so little from it. The official investigation made recommendations. Some were implemented. Air traffic control procedures were updated. Minimum safe altitudes were more strictly enforced. Pilot training was modified to emphasize the dangers of descending in low visibility over urban areas. But the cultural lessons, the deeper implications, those were ignored. America in 1945 wanted to move forward, not look back. The war was ending. The future was bright. Why dwell in a tragic accident when there was a whole new world to build? So the Empire State Building crash became a footnote, a piece of trivia, a story old-timers told but nobody really internalized. And then, 56 years later, planes hit buildings in New York again. Different circumstances, different causes, different scale, but the same fundamental question. How did we not see this coming? After 9/11, people searched for parallels, for historical precedents, for anything that might help make sense of the senseless. Some remembered the Empire State Building. Journalists wrote retrospectives. Survivors gave interviews. Betty Lou Oliver's story was retold for a new generation. And people asked, why didn't we learn? If we'd taken the 1945 crash more seriously, if we'd studied it more carefully, if we'd let it shape our thinking about aviation and buildings and security, would 9/11 have been different? Probably not. The circumstances were too different. The intent was too different. One was an accident caused by pilot error. The other was a calculated attack by people who wanted to kill as many Americans as possible. You can't prevent terrorism by studying accidents. But maybe, if the Empire State Building crash had maintained a stronger presence in American consciousness, if it had been taught in schools and remembered on anniversaries and studied by engineers and security professionals, maybe the idea of planes hitting buildings wouldn't have seemed so unimaginable. Maybe the imagination of worst-case scenarios would have been broader. Maybe the planning would have been better. Or maybe not. Maybe history doesn't work that way. Maybe some lessons can't be learned until they're experienced firsthand. Maybe we're condemned to repeat our mistakes no matter how much we study the past. But I don't want to believe that. I want to believe that remembering matters, that stories like this one serve a purpose beyond entertainment or curiosity, that understanding what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Smith and Betty Lou Oliver
and those 14 people who went to work on July 28th, 1945 and never came home, that understanding these stories makes us wiser, more careful, more humble about what we know and what we don't know. The Empire State Building stands today, 94 years after it was built, 79 years after it was struck by a bomber. It's no longer the tallest building in New York. One World Trade Center claimed that distinction. It's not even in the top 5 anymore. But it remains iconic, instantly recognizable, a symbol of New York resilience. Tourists still line up for hours to take the elevator to the observation deck on the 86th floor. They take photos of the skyline. They marvel at the view. Most of them have no idea that 7 floors below where they're standing, a plane once punched a hole through the building and created a fireball that should have brought the whole thing down. And maybe that's okay. Maybe every building doesn't need to be a memorial. Maybe some scars should heal invisibly. Maybe the fact that the Empire State Building stands without obvious damage is itself the memorial, a testament to engineering and resilience, and the stubborn refusal to let one bad day define a structure. But I think we owe it to the 14 people who died that day to remember. Not to wallow in tragedy, not to fetishize disaster, but to understand what happened and why and what it meant. Catherine O'Connor was 37 years old. She was a stenographer for the National Catholic Welfare Conference. She was at her desk when the plane hit. She didn't have time to understand what was happening before the fire consumed her. She left behind a husband and 3 children. Paul Deering was 34, an accountant, married, 2 kids. He was probably working on some mundane spreadsheet, thinking about lunch when the world exploded around him. Every one of the 14 victims had a story, a life, people who loved them, plans for the future. They didn't die in combat. They didn't die fighting for a cause. They died because a pilot got lost in fog and made a bad decision. And Lieutenant Colonel William F. Smith Jr. deserves to be remembered too, not as a villain or a scapegoat, but as a human being who made a mistake, a decorated veteran who'd served his country with distinction and died doing something that should have been routine. His wife was 5 months pregnant when he died. She named their son after him. William F. Smith III never met his father. These are the human costs of the story. These are the reasons it matters. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Not just the facts, not just the dramatic tale of a plane hitting a skyscraper, but the deeper truth underneath. The Empire State Building crash revealed something essential about American character in the 1940s. The firefighters who climbed 79 floors with full gear didn't have to do that. Nobody would have blamed them for saying it was too dangerous, too high, too risky. But they did it anyway because that's what heroes do. They don't calculate odds. They don't overthink. They see people who need help and they go help. Betty Lou Oliver surviving a 75-story elevator fall revealed something about the unpredictability of fate. She shouldn't have lived. Every rule of physics said she should have died. But she didn't. Sometimes impossible things happen. Sometimes miracles are real. Not because God intervenes or karma balances out, but because the universe is fundamentally chaotic and sometimes chaos produces outcomes that look like magic. The way the story was forgotten revealed something about how nations process trauma. America in 1945 was exhausted from 4 years of war, rationing, anxiety, death. When the war finally ended, people wanted to celebrate and move forward. They didn't want to process more tragedy. They didn't want to analyze another disaster. They wanted peace and normalcy and a future that looked different from the past. So they forgot. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but because forgetting was easier than remembering. But here's the thing. When we forget our history, we lose the chance to learn from it. When we bury our disasters under layers of optimism and denial, we guarantee that we'll be surprised when similar disasters happen again. The Empire State Building crash should have taught us about the dangers of overconfidence in aviation, about the need for better air traffic control, about the importance of respecting weather conditions and knowing your limitations, about how to design buildings that can survive impacts, about disaster preparedness in urban environments. Some of those lessons were learned, some weren't. And 56 years later, when planes hit buildings in New York again, we weren't as prepared as we should have been. I'm not saying the two events are equivalent. They're not. 9/11 was an act of war. The Empire State Building crash was an accident. The scale was different, the intent was different, the aftermath was different. But both events revealed that planes can hit buildings. Both events showed that disasters can happen in places we think are safe. Both events tested the resilience of New York and America. And both events asked the same question: what do we do the day after? How do we rebuild? How do we remember? How do we move forward without forgetting? New York rebuilt after July 28, 1945. The damaged offices were repaired, the broken windows were replaced, the burned floors were refinished. Within weeks, the building was fully operational again. The observation deck reopened, tourists returned, life went on. And that's the right response to disaster. You don't abandon the building. You don't tear it down because something bad happened there. You fix it. You make it stronger. You learn from what went wrong, and you make sure it doesn't go wrong the same way again. But you also remember. You mark the moment. You honor the people who died and the people who saved lives. You tell the story so future generations know what happened and why it mattered. We didn't do that well with the Empire State Building crash. The story faded too quickly. The lessons were learned incompletely. The memory was preserved inadequately. But here's the good news. It's not too late. The story still exists. The survivors left records. The firefighters left journals. The photographs were saved. The wreckage was preserved. The history is accessible to anyone who wants to learn it. All we have to do is decide that it matters. All we have to do is remember that on a foggy Saturday morning in July 1945, a veteran pilot made a mistake that killed 14 people and almost brought down America's most iconic building. That firefighters climbed higher than any fire crew had ever climbed before. That a young woman survived the impossible. That New York was tested and didn't break. That's the story. That's what happened. And now you know. You can't unknow it. It's part of your understanding of history now. You know that before 9/11, New York had already been hit. You know that planes hitting buildings isn't a new terror. It's a recurring nightmare that started decades before most people realize. You know that the Empire State Building has stood through victory and disaster and tragedy and triumph. That it was built strong enough to survive what nobody imagined would ever happen. That it represents not just human ambition, but human resilience.
So the next time you see the Empire State Building, whether in person or in a photograph or in a movie, remember July 28, 1945. Remember Lieutenant Colonel Smith, who lost his way in fog. Remember the 11 people who went to work and never came home. Remember Betty Lou Oliver, who filled 75 floors and lived to tell about it. Remember the firefighters who climbed and climbed and climbed, not knowing if the building would stand or fall, not caring about the danger, just focused on saving whoever they could save. Remember that New York has survived worse than most people realize, that the city's toughness isn't an act or a brand, it's earned through generations of refusing to quit when quitting would be easier. Remember that forgetting history doesn't make us safer, it makes us vulnerable. The disasters we don't study are the disasters we're doomed to experience again. And remember that every building has a story. Every structure is more than steel and concrete. The Empire State Building isn't just a tourist attraction or an office complex. It's a survivor. It's a witness to history. It's a reminder that we can build things strong enough to withstand the unimaginable. On July 28, 1945, the unimaginable happened. A bomber fell out of the sky and crashed into the heart of New York. The building shook but didn't fall. The fire burned but was conquered. The disaster traumatized but didn't destroy. And 80 years later, the building still stands, proud, iconic, undefeated. That's not just engineering. That's not just luck. That's the physical manifestation of a truth about America that we sometimes forget. We know how to build things that last. We know how to survive what shouldn't be survivable. We know how to take the worst day imaginable and turn it into just another day we got through. The Empire State Building survived a plane crash. New York survived a plane crash. America survived a plane crash. And we forgot it almost immediately. But now you remember. Now you know. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how history stays alive. One person learning the story, then telling it to another person, then another until the story refuses to die. because some stories are too important to forget. Some moments define us, whether we acknowledge them or not, and some buildings stand as monuments not just to ambition, but to survival. The Empire State Building is one of those buildings. July 28, 1945 is one of those moments, and this is one of those stories. Don't forget it.